I want to talk to you about some aspects of role playing games that I feel are being either misrepresented or overplayed in many explainer videos found on YouTube, namely story, role playing, and immersion. I would like to begin by providing some information about my own background. I do not offer this background information to qualify my quote expertise in doling out dicta about how other people must approach role playing games. However, I am by nature inclined to give my personal opinions without constantly reminding my audience that I can only provide non binding recommendations. So, if at some point I seem like an opinionated jerk, then please remember that ultimately, not only do I respect your right to choose what is best for you, but I also relish the differences between us. So, let's start with a bit of preamble about me. Firstly, I'm a Secretary of the Interior qualified principal investigator and registered professional archaeologist. I hold a Master of Arts degree in applied anthropology, as well as a bachelor's in anthropology and associates in humanities. While this has not made me an expert in telling people how to play tabletop role playing games, it does mean that I've acquired a professional academic qualification in the holistic study of human beings as culture bearing biological organisms, which includes the social dynamics of play behaviors, both cross culturally and through time. Secondly, I would also like to note that I am both a published author of fictional prose and poetry and an experienced stage actor who has been evaluated at state level competitions as well as being involved in local community theater. I do not offer these facts as an appeal to my own authority. Clearly, I am neither a famous author nor a famous actor. However, I want to mention these details specifically because I wish my audience to understand that I am making these recommendations based on actual personal experiences, not from ideas that I've culled from social media or from potentially slanted articles found on purportedly journalistic websites. Lastly, as a statement of purpose, I wish to comment on why I'm choosing to share this advice here and now. Over the past several weeks, I have watched a number of live streams and pre recorded videos suggesting that if I do not follow the advice of the content creators, then I am playing TTRPGs wrong, or worse, that I'm simply too stupid or ignorant to play them correctly. While I cannot offer any ideas about how many potential new players are pushed away from the hobby by encountering these hyperbolic statements, I can say that these assertions only serve to promote asymmetrical acceptance as facts, the very things that should be the subjects of open dialogue. I want to preface this commentary with what may seem like a common platitude in the TTRPG hobby space. If you're enjoying these games in the company of people you like, then you are getting it right. It really is that simple. Everything beyond that is just advice about how to interpret a specific set of game rules or recommendations based on what has enhanced enjoyment of these games for other players. You certainly should not let any video on a social media platform push you away from trying out a new pastime. No matter what anyone tells you that you must do to play the game correctly, remember that you never have to play with them. More importantly, though, don't stop looking for advice and recommendations from others. Whether experienced old timers or just others who are new to the hobby and learning as they go, it is exposure to the different perspectives coming from differing backgrounds and experiences that will most enrich your own time in the hobby. So, with all that said, let's start drilling down on the topics of story and in character role playing. I think that both these topics are often dismissed because the person giving the advice is focused on the end products rather than the processes as a whole. That is, the final written narrative or the lines to be delivered by an actor are themselves the end products of a process. The role playing game should not be taken as a means to circumvent the process. However, these games do seek to produce collaboratively enacted, emergent narratives that are performed by characters who differ in some meaningful way from the players that embody those roles. I recall many years ago, while participating in a writer's workshop, one of the group leaders paraphrased Aristotle from his work Poetics in describing a story as simply being a narrative that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Of course, from there, many of the participants started suggesting other conventional elements of storytelling that they felt were important. What about conflict, plot, setting, characters, viewpoint, themes? Yes, was the reply. Yes to all those things. But at the most basic level, if you have a coherent beginning, middle, and end, then you have a story. So what interest do anthropologists have in stories? And this recent article by Barbara Gotch and Monica Palmberger, entitled The Nexus of Anthropology and Narrative Ethnographic Encounters with Storytelling Practices, provides a good overview of why anthropologists are interested in stories and what we study as part of storytelling. As the bridge between the public and private, storytelling is a social phenomenon. It appears across the world, and it has persisted in history. It is globally pervasive, but at the same time locally and culturally situated. This tension is what anthropologists are called on to scrutinize. Anthropologists are interested in the product of storytelling, the finished story, and the practice and process of storytelling. They study the content and the social life of a story. In other words, the way it is co-created and altered, the different ways it is interpreted, how it is used to create, sustain, or mock identities. They study how it contributes to the emergence and sustenance of sociality and sociability, and how it relates to temporality and space. Anthropologists are interested in how narratives help individuals and groups make sense of experience, how narratives contribute to socializations into group practice, norms, or moral values, and how they help to transmit ideologies, theories, or imaginaries. Finally, anthropologists pay attention to moments of silence, when narrators cannot or do not want to speak. In their analyses, anthropologists are sensitive to the context, history, and power relations that reign in a particular situation, and they carefully reflect on the narrative representations of social life, including the critical reading of ethnographic texts. But what are the types of story to an anthropologist? This quoted passage from The Anthropology of Storytelling and the Storytelling of Anthropology by Rodolfo Maggio provides a fairly good idea of just how broad the concept of story is to an anthropologist. A story can be many things, if not all things: account, achievement, adventure, alibi, allegory, anthropology, and all words ending with logy, anecdote, apology, ballad, belief, bet, byword, case study, catharsis, challenge, chat, chronicle, confession, contrivance, correspondence, creation, crisis, defamation, disagreement, discourse, discovery, discursive formation, dream, epic, episode, etymology, event, excuse, experience, fable, faction, failure, fantasy, fiction, binding, folly, function, future, glossolalia, gossip, happening, hearsay, heresy, hesitation, historiography, and all words ending with graphy, information, interpretation, invention, issue, joke, journey, justification, legend, lesson, lie, matter, metamorphosis, metaphor, model, myth, narrative, news, nightmare, novel, ontogeny, phylogeny, and other words ending with jenny, past perspective, plot, poem, poesis, praise, prayer, prejudice, pretense, pretext, problem, project, promise, prophecy, protest, question, reason, recital, recommendation, religion, report, research, reverie, ritual, rumor, scene, science, slander, statement, subject, tale, testimony, translation, travel, truth, vicissitude, yarn, zeitgeist. Everything can be a story, if only because everything is the outcome of a process. Only not everything is sayable. Of course, what is ineffable may still be expressed through nonverbal communication. However, that assumes that the message transmitter and receiver are connected through media that permit the nonverbal to be communicated. Fortunately, most of those messages can be communicated through the various means of connecting remotely that we have at our disposal today. And that's what I get out of the writing experience. But let's get back to more conventionally known elements of a story, with an eye towards situating the elements within a group context. I included an early version of the Jack and Gill nursery rhyme at the beginning of this section because it actually makes a fairly complete story, but one that leaves a lot of room for additions. In fact, over the years, verses have been added or altered. Even character names have been changed. Jill. Still, we know that our characters, Jack and Gill, are motivated to go up a hill to fetch a pail of water, that Jack is injured along the way, and Gill is thwarted in his efforts by Jack's injury. A beginning, a middle, and an end, complete with motivation and conflict. In short, a story. I don't want to focus on the content of an old nursery rhyme, but before we move away from that topic, let's consider at least one interpretation of the story's meaning. In 1625, King Charles I of England decreed a reduction in the size of the jack, which is about a quarter cup, so that he could increase his tax revenues. And this also caused a size reduction in the gill, which was twice the volume of a jack. The mark to which the alcohol was poured was typically a crown as a symbol of royal authority. Thus, the king's commanded change in measured volume broke the old instruments of measurement. It is all speculation on my part, of course, but the reason for fetching a pail of water may have been to increase the volume of what was sold to the customer to its historical amount. So, for those familiar with that background information, even one short verse can tell a meaningful story. The historical interpretations of nursery rhymes aside, what has all this to do with collaboratively created emergent narratives stemming from a tabletop role-playing game? Well, my point is going to be that there are multiple elements of story that are brought to the gaming table by the game master, and also more elements than just character that are brought to the table by each player. While the emerging narrative may not become a completed story until the game has come to its conclusion, it is still a story, while it is in the process of being created by the interactions of the group. The game master must come to the table with enough of a setting to provide the players with a stage from which they will perform or enact their characters. Moreover, the GM will bring their own characters as well as some bases for indicating the tone and themes that will be introduced at the beginning of play, and most importantly, an initial source of conflict. Now, the setting, tone, themes, etc. will be reshaped by the actions of the group playing out the adventures. It is these interactions and communications that will form the reshaping influence of style, pace, mood, and points of view. Thus, while the GM is well advised to not prepare rigid plot arcs, they must bring some plot elements to the table. The narrative will then emerge from how the group chooses to create connections among those plot elements. Character development is a special case in tabletop role-playing games. The characters' lines must generally be improvised as the game proceeds and in response to the actions, including speech acts of other characters. One of the typical objections to considering the role-playing gamer as a dramatic actor is based on the reductive notion that actors only deliver written lines. This leaves character development as little more than imitative of established dramatic conventions or emulation of established archetypes. However, much as I said for writing, I contend that making a character is a process. To some, this may all seem like contemporary thinking about role-playing games that has been superimposed onto the hobby by a new generation of players. However, this quote taken from the Dragon magazine shows that it was definitely in Gary Gygax's mind as he was getting the first edition of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons into the marketplace. At the risk of claiming too much for the game, I have lately taken to likening the whole to Aristotle's Poetics, carrying the analogy to even more ridiculous heights by stating that each dungeon master uses the rules to become a playwright, hopefully of Shakespearean stature, scripting only plot outlines, however, and the players become the thespians. Dungeons & Dragons is like none other in that it requires the game master to create part or all of a fantasy world. Players must then become personae in this place and interact with the other populace. Before I continue with some thoughts about how to build a character, I want to establish the end goal. This is intended to make the idea seem more reasonable for those who do not want to make up silly voices or perform their characters with a wild theatricality. I am myself admittedly a staunch beer and pretzels type role-playing gamer. The very basic bottom line is that you simply need to understand how your game character is different from you and how that will inform the choices they make during the game. And of course, sometimes that will mean that your game character will react to something in a way that you would not. Consider for yourself if confronted with a similar situation in the physical world. Sometimes what you think your character would do is something that you would consider stupid or foolish. In these times, remind yourself that there is no hard concept of winning or losing in tabletop role-playing games. I'm going to couch my suggestions within the framework for character development promulgated by Konstantin Stanislavski, more or less consistently with his presentation in his books An Actor Prepares and Building a Character. The obvious exception being that, much as Stanislavski himself in later years, I do not recommend the use of emotion memory. For one thing, it seems psychologically ill-advised for a fun pastime with friends, and for another thing, it seems to present too much opportunity to use self-insertion as a crutch for developing an independent character. Finally, please remember that this is ultimately advice for playing a game, not for pursuing a career in dramatic acting. So take this advice with a grain of salt, except to the extent that it provides you with ideas about how to make your role-playing character into something other than just a projection of yourself into a fantasy world. The foundational elements of this approach are given circumstances and the magic if. In an example from An Actor Prepares, Stanislavski assigns a student to take on the role of an oak tree. The student replies that he can perform the role, but will not actually believe himself to be an oak tree. To this student's objection, Stanislavski replied, "Why don't you say to yourself, 'I am I, but if I were an old oak set in certain surrounding conditions, what would I do?' And decide where you are, in a forest, in a meadow, on a mountaintop, in whatever place affects you most." I like that example because it illustrates that an oak tree is bound to some extent to its given circumstances. An oak must remain rooted in its local soil, reproduce by acorn, produce energy through photosynthesis, etc. However, with that understanding, the choices are constrained by the given circumstances. It is nonetheless possible to build up a character on the basis of proceeding as if you were such a being. The character's choices are what is limited, not the player's choices. Before leaving the previous example, I also want to note that there is an allusion to Stanislavski's early position of recommending the use of emotion memory in constructing a character's identity in the "I am I, but" part of that example. Although I agree with Stanislavski's later position that the use of emotion memory is ultimately counterproductive, often producing internal conflicts that lead to mechanical performances. I think there is some value in never fully losing the connection to your actual self in constructing believable character identities. In later years, Stanislavski emphasized using physicality to find authentic characterizations. With that in mind, I offer this quote from An Actor Prepares. "Never lose yourself on the stage. Always act in your own person. As an artist, you can never get away from yourself. The moment you lose yourself on the stage marks the departure from truly living your part and the beginning of exaggerated false acting." We will revisit this concept in the section on immersion. The next most important admonition from Stanislavski is in declaring that truly authentic performances come from the actors playing to, that is, reacting to, each other's performances. This is what Stanislavski referred to as communion. To be in communion with one another, the players must make every effort to maintain an uninterrupted exchange of feelings, thoughts, and actions amongst themselves. When you choose to perform your character's part and then go back to burying your face in some device or letting your thoughts wander aimlessly, then you are actively choosing to diminish the roles being performed by your fellow players. Next, I would like to introduce the related concepts of objective and superobjective. My advice here is to consider your character's objectives on a scene-by-scene or encounter-by-encounter basis. Let the character's precise objectives in each instance work themselves into the overarching through line that forms the character's superobjective. Stanislavski phrased it thusly: in a play, the whole stream of individual minor objectives, all the imaginative thoughts, feelings, and actions of an actor, should converge to carry out the superobjective of the plot. The common bond must be so strong that even the most insignificant detail, if it is not related to the superobjective, will stand out as superfluous or wrong. And finally, I want to touch on some areas for character development that might get overlooked. Firstly, don't just think about who your character is within the given circumstances of the world, or what they'll say, or how they will verbalize their reactions. Give some thought to the physicality of your character, their movements, gestures, etc. Does the character slink along in the shadows, or are they a self-aggrandizing bombast who commands everyone's attention? Secondly, don't just react to the text of what other characters, including the GM's characters, are saying. You should consider the subtext and also allow yourself to react to cues picked up subconsciously, even ones that are coming from outside the milieu of the game world.
Here's one last quote from Stanislavski to close out this section.
You now have the power to create favorable conditions for the birth of inspiration. Therefore, put your thought on what arouses your inner motive forces, what makes for your inner creative mood. Think of your superobjective and the through line of action that leads to it. In short, have in your mind everything that can be consciously controlled, and that will lead you to the subconscious. That is the best possible preparation for inspiration. But never try for a direct approach to inspiration for its own sake. It will result in physical contortion and the opposite of everything you desire.
In this last section, I want to deal with the seemingly widely held belief that by staying in character at all times while participating in the tabletop role-playing game, one can achieve a transcendent state of immersion. I do think that this is possible. However, I also think it selfishly serves only the individual player and is ultimately not conducive to playing in communion with the other players, by which I mean to include the game master. That said, while I believe individual immersion is self-serving, I also believe there is a satisfactory alternative, which I will call willful suspension of disbelief by group Fiat. Here's another quote from Gary Gygax. Dungeons & Dragons is a cooperative game where players must interact successfully amongst themselves first, and non-hostile portions of the campaign milieu thereafter, in order to be successful. As with any exercise in fantasy, it requires suspension of disbelief. I would like to begin by acknowledging that, like much of what I've said in this video so far, this interpretation does depend on how each of us defines these terms for ourselves. I also want to acknowledge that by choosing to play these games together, we are also choosing not to do other things with our free time. We should all respect the time investment being made by everyone at the table. And that said, I do think this touches on one of the core tenets of old school role-playing, which prioritizes development of the shared setting over any individual character. One of my personal main complaints about new style role-playing games is that they seem to present a world where each player should see their character as the star of the show. Even worse, the game master's characters are left to have no purpose other than servicing the wishes of each player individually. To me, it seems like we have a tool that can help to break us out of being fully immersed in the constructed reality of the physical world we share, and we only want to use it to fully immerse ourselves within another constructed reality, and only on the condition that the shared fantasy world provides a complete escape from what we dislike about the physical world. Personally, I've never desired to escape from that shared reality, only to better understand alterity by providing myself with a space for making different decisions than I would normally make, in an effort to better understand people's rationale for making alternate decisions for themselves. My opinion as an anthropologist is that we will achieve something more usefully transcendent by continually vacillating between in-character and out-of-character moments shared between our fellow players. In fact, I think it is specifically due to the constant shifting between in and out-of-character mindset that we achieve a liminal state, wherein we are presented with a moment in and out of time and in and out of secular social structure, which reveals, however fleetingly, some recognition in symbol, if not always in language, of a generalized social bond that has ceased to be and has simultaneously yet to be fragmented into a multiplicity of structural ties. In short, this is what Victor Turner referred to as communitas, meaning community, or even communion of equal individuals who submit together to the general authority. Additionally, I think there are more pragmatic reasons to be more permissive about out-of-character chat. Firstly, the characters do not have recourse to all the sensory information that would be available to real people acting in real space. The players must be allowed to speak up when they need more detail. Secondly, game masters are often somewhat ambiguous about whether a given action will be treated as assumed to be successful, or whether success will depend upon role play, that's R-O-L-E, or role, that's R-O-L-L play. Players must be allowed to ask for clarification before they commit to an action that could have serious repercussions for the character. One of my experiences from my time in dramatic theater was that the actors who were not on stage during a public performance were usually not in character. And in fact, most of the time they were gossiping about those who were on stage, or talking about what they intended to do after the show, or figuring out where the after party would be held. However, as soon as they took the stage, they shifted into character. Of course, some were more successful than others at getting into character, but for the most part, it was achievable because they had put the work into immersing themselves into figuring out the character's nature outside of public performances, practice, or rehearsal. I would like to close out this section with a discussion about a topic that I frequently hear mentioned in reference to tabletop gaming groups, the social contract. Rousseau's original coinage of the term referred more to government being dependent upon the consent of the governed. It is much more a part of political theory and philosophy than its common usage would imply. I believe its application to tabletop gaming becomes problematic when the, quote, government is perceived to be the game master exclusively, or the rules as written. If we take the governing principle to stem from the agreement of the group to share in the willful suspension of disbelief, temporarily, for the purpose of collaboratively creating and playing through an imagined shared world, then I think the main tenets of Rousseau's social pact do apply. This is what I refer to as willful suspension of disbelief by group Fiat. Rousseau addressed his text to an assumed male audience, and I will not make any effort to update the language for the purpose of quoting it. Rousseau's sexist language aside, it applies to all people living under a government or other shared set of rules. I think these tenets make a good case for the use of a game master as an impartial referee, not just to adjudicate player actions in relationship to the rules, but also to prevent the tyranny of the rules themselves. This is, of course, another tenet of old school role-playing, rulings over rules. So, the first item of the social pact is, these articles of association, rightly understood, are reducible to a single one, namely the total alienation by each associate of himself and all his rights to the whole community. Thus, in the first place, as every individual gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all, and precisely because they are the same for all, it is in no one's interest to make the conditions onerous for others. Second item of Rousseau's social pact. Secondly, since the alienation is unconditional, the union is as perfect as it could be, and no individual associate has any longer any rights to claim. For if rights were left to individuals, in the absence of any higher authority to judge between them and the public, being his own judge in some causes would soon demand to be his own judge in all, and in this way the state of nature would be kept in being, and the association inevitably become either tyrannical or void. And of course, the third section of Rousseau's social pact. Finally, since each man gives himself to all, he gives himself to no one. And since there is no associate over whom he does not gain the same rights as others gain over him, each man recovers the equivalent of everything he loses, and in the bargain he acquires more power to preserve what he has.
Well, that has all covered a lot of ground for a single video, so I'd like to wrap things up by offering some more concise messaging for each of the subtopics. The most obvious note applying to all that I've said is that this type of grandiose thinking is best kept entirely away from the gaming table. I do enjoy complicating things, but game time is meant for enjoyment of the hobby, so just have fun with it. In regards to storytelling, the key is that the players must bring more to the table than just fixed ideas about their characters, just as the game master must bring more than just fixed plot points. Mood, style, and pace are all parts of the story that will arise out of interactions between the game master and the other players, and will vary by game session. Game masters should keep in mind the individual points of view held by the players' characters. However, the players of individual characters must appreciate that the game master employs many points of view beyond just their own as the impartial referee. The take-home message for the role-playing section really is just to remember that your character was born and raised in a world different than your own as a player. They're not just separate personalities, but originate from separate realities. Ultimately, it isn't about vocalizing their lines with a voice other than your normal one, or picturing them dressed in costumes appropriate to their world. It is about deciding how their decisions will differ from those you would make, and then playing your character as if they made those decisions. As put in a quote from Stanislavski from Building a Character, love art in yourself and not yourself in art. As for immersion, just remember that while it is advisable to find ways to inhabit your character, you are always part of an ensemble, even if you are soloing a game. Moreover, come to understand that part of what it means to live in a society is that your exercise of agency will often impinge on the agency of others. We must learn to do this with grace, humility, and continuous acknowledgement of the other. Don't abandon your fellow players at the table just because it is not your character's turn in the spotlight. To sum it all up with one last quote from Stanislavski, every worker in the theater, from the doorman, the ticket taker, the hat check girl, the usher, all the people the public comes into contact with as they enter the theater, on up to the managers, the staff, and finally the actors themselves. They all are co-creators with the playwright, the composer, for the sake of whose play the audience assembles. They all serve, they're all subject to the fundamental aim of our art. They all, without exception, are participants in the production. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again at the next video.